All right, welcome to another episode of Can I Say Something? I'm very excited to be talking to my next guest today, Mary Jane Oatman. She is the executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association and the founder of THC Magazine. Mary Jane is a member of the Nez Perce Indigenous community. She is an advocate in the cannabis rights community for a long time, very passionate speaker on that as well as many other issues, and really excited to have her on. Before I mispronounce and misfumble anything else on there, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Jane for a much more elaborate description on who she is.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a high honor to join your show. I'm actually joining you from the ancestral homelands of my people here in Nimiipuu territory. Present day, we're known as the Nez Perce people, but I'm in my hometown where I was born and raised, a little place in Idaho, north central Idaho called Kamiai. And my community, the name Kamiai derives from the word kamu, which was our word for Indian hemp, which is a part of our creation story. So, the work that I do is more rematriation.
Yeah, and that was actually what I wanted to dive into. What is, that with such a deep history and connection to it, what was it like for you growing up? When was cannabis introduced to you? Was it, sort of a day one introduction, sort of, an essential introduction, from the moment you were here, or how did it come into your life growing up?
In utero, my mother was a cannabis user full term during her pregnancy. Early on, it helped her have an appetite. She was she used it as medicine throughout her pregnancy with all of my brothers and sisters, and so it was. Mom, sorry, I'm so sorry, Mom.
It's okay.
That's right. My mom, she's just getting home, so she's like doing her singing to all her grandbabies. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's totally fine.
Yeah. Okay. So leaving off. So my mom, my wonderful mom there.
There we go.
She has been, really pivotal. Of course, she was introduced to cannabis through my dad, and it was it's been a part of his, teenage years. He grew up around, some of his uncles being cannabis consumers and users. And from my upbringing, I've always just known and have been taught that it was medicine. So that's always been my perspective with it. It's always been a part of my life. It was a part of my household on a daily basis. And my own relationship with it has evolved over time. When I was younger, hated the smell of it, didn't like that my friends couldn't come over because, then my parents would be outed as cannabis users. So I had a period of time where I really didn't like Mary Jane.
Wow, interesting. Wow. And so it wasn't used throughout the community then. It was more of a family sort of passing on of the heritage. Would that be correct to say?
Well, because, our kinship systems is really what used to be the governance systems of our people prior to colonial contact and before, the modern governments of what we know today as tribes. Everything was derived through kinship systems. And I descend from a treaty chief that was the second signatory of the Nez Treaty of 1855, which was, created mirroring the legal framework and language of a most favored nations treaty. And a big part of the bargaining and negotiating and contemplation for that agreement, that contract with the United States government, was done over sacred smoke. It's in, the Journal of the United States government. It was actually some of the agents that were sent to negotiate that treaty with on behalf of the United States with Governor Isaac Stevens at the time. And they write at lengths that, these Indian chiefs, they just sit around and smoke all the time. And they're always just, talking about things and praying on things, and we want to execute this decision. They had a timeline that they had to stick to and they didn't realize. That's kind of where that nuance of Indian time comes from. There's this really funny saying about Indian time. It's not about being late. It's about things happening when they're supposed to, as a more of a spirit driven kind of thing. And our treaty meeting minutes showcase and document forensically in a legal way that smoking sacrament was a part of our way of life. There's provisions within our treaties that protect the herbs, within our treaty.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. And then, kind of, I want to dive into the intricacies and the nuances and the different beliefs among each indigenous community and tribes. But I wanted to kind of touch on your work more so. You were saying it's the rematriation. Kind of, can you describe what that work entails and what you've been, when you got involved in it, what you've been up to?
For me, the work of rematriation of plant medicines, including hemp and cannabis, from the textile perspective, as well as plant medicine healings, really comes from, who were the keepers of that proprietary way of life. And for my community, prehistorically, it was our women. And it was a part of our agriculture, just like gathering our roots and gathering our berries and harvesting our woods and our natural fibers. We were rope making people. The Kamuyamupa people were known throughout the Columbia Plateau salmon fishing communities. That's what made us such a rich and powerful tribe, was the rope that we made and the way of life that rope provided. It was a huge commerce. And while it may have been the men that went and negotiated in those trade during their fishing trips or their buffalo harvesting trips, it was the women that provided that commodity for that trade. It's a part of our creation story as well for the Nez Perce people. And so the rematriation is a part of the role of our grandmothers in passing down story, something that was fractured through colonization. Those were our laws. Those were, embedded into our DNA, and the disruption of our language systems and our kinship systems can and must be matriated, and that's a strong responsibility of women to do that work.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's got to be such an uphill battle. We always know the cannabis legalization story, whether it be from the indigenous communities or from just the U.S. states, just trying to get anything on the federal government to take any action is just, it seems like an uphill battle, and especially to marginalized communities like the indigenous groups over the years. What has it been like to get, that sovereignty to actually have the cannabis legalization? And, the federal government didn't seem like they were really kind of allowing that to happen very easily over the years. Was that correct?
Oh, that's very correct. We've had a lot of battles and challenges where tribes are trying to figure out how they can do it better than state systems, for transparency, more accountability. What does, this look like for a tribally controlled and regulated system? Because, communities like the Bay Mills Indian community in Michigan, they weren't going to wait for permission from the state of Michigan to move forward. And I always see that community as being one for our tribes to see as a potential blueprint, because the president of the Bay Mills Indian community that worked on the development project is now the assistant secretary at the Department of Interior, Brian Newland. And I think it is really imperative that tribes see beacon models, fully vertically integrated, and creating the brand for their community under that Northern Lights dispensary, and showcasing the geographic culture of Michigan historically as being a cannabis community.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's one thing, on a kind of stepping back basic level, I think a lot of folks just don't even the common folks don't even realize that there is just varying laws across the indigenous nations, and realizing that there's so much different varied viewpoints and, different perspectives and, cultural backgrounds to the plant. Can you kind of talk about how that intricacy has worked into, different perspectives on legalizations, models and usages, and, like you said, perspectives on, not even waiting for the states to say anything?
There's 574 federally recognized tribes, which means that there could potentially be 574 unique sets of codes and ordinances driving the public safety. Some of them work together, like what happened in Nevada, where they're, trying to figure out how They can create an intertribal commerce model. The tribes in Washington state, they compacted, Washington was one of the earliest states to legalize. And so we saw a big push for recreational retail tribal enterprises in that state. But again, because there's that nuance of sovereignty and self-determination, there have been a few tribes in Washington state where they have opted out. And if you're driving through that reservation and you're pulled over, then you will still face I believe they have very high level civil penalties, low level criminal penalties, but that's in a state where there's 10 years of maturity in the market, and it's still illegal in that reservation community in an I-502 state, and that's California is its own whole interesting, with over 100 tribes in California. It's its own case study.
Exactly. Yeah.
Big research proposal.
And and what's crazy is like, some people, if you're in the know in the cannabis industry, it's pretty, decently well aware of these sort of things. But like really on the outside of it, like you said, people don't even know, like they can just be driving through and not know the laws of the land, not know that, in my case in New York, the Shinnecock and the St. Regis tribes, they have their own markets. They have completely different rules to the New York state rules. And, there's a lot of pros and cons and differences, but it just seems like there's such an education gap between, what's going on in the tribal lands and what's going on U.S. territory. And it just kind of seems maddening because like this in and of itself, like you said, California is its own case study. There's so much interesting perspective, I think, that we can both learn and grow from one another. And it just doesn't seem like it's happening at the moment. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And a big part of that is many of the tribes are moving kind of stealthy. They don't want to put their business out of the streets. I mean, look what happened to Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe when they showcased what they were going to do. While they were not shut down by the feds, all the writing was on the wall and all of their, boots on the ground were telling them just, shut it down and not now. And they've come full circle with their project and they're doing very successful, could potentially be one of our first tribes to franchise a model outside of their own community in the future, may already be doing it, so there's really interesting things that are happening. But, again, with so many tribes, keeping up with it, I think, is also difficult when there's some of the consultants that are working with them are not necessarily executing the tribal delivery really with a nuanced brand. They're just trying to help them get a retail storefront, not necessarily thinking, tribe, you could own cultivation in this region. You can create, some, and then also for me, I really want to see more tribes stay in the lane of medical. I mean, we're going to have the future for the next 20 years is going to be saturated with federal appropriations for efficacy and research for cannabis around all of these health disparities that our communities suffer from disproportionately. So why not make those connections now?
Right. Yeah. And with the way, like you said, with the research and everything going on there, and also with the states on usually when they turn to an adult use legalization, you see almost the death of the medical markets over there. It almost seems kind of poetic that it would go back to the indigenous operators that knew how this plant was a medicine from, ages back, that they would be the ones who might end up a leading force in it.
Well, there are some tribes that are utilizing a competitive advantage, through taxing structures with their dispensaries. But, most of them are charging taxes in parity with what the local and state taxes are. Sometimes just slightly below, maybe to pull some of that population over to their dispensary to save a few dollars here and there. But I think that the biggest thing that we would see is if tribes are now staying in the medical lane and not the recreational lane, then that eliminates a whole nother level of tax.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's an interesting point too about the parity with the states. I've talked to a few operators in my area, and it seems like, they do that to kind of make sure minimize the chance of any sort of interference from the regulators. Is that usually the case? Would, if that limit wasn't there, or if that worry wasn't there, I should say, would we see, kind of varying different markets, do you think? Or what kind of, how would that play out?
I would see that in states specifically like New York, like we witnessed with the tobacco wars, that it would be very similar like that. That's why the tribes now are like, okay, we have to cultivate. They're trying to basically mirror what happened during the attacks on tribal sovereignty over trade, commerce, and transportation with tobacco, to learn from those lessons and, find ways to be cultivators. But there's, prehistorically and today, contemporary times, been veins of commerce, prehistoric trail routes that have always had medicines in them. They never really ever went away. And so even within regulated regulated tribal cannabis markets, I think that there's still that very palatable visible legacy, just like in mainstream legacy, there's still the indigenous legacy communities. And so tribal communities themselves are trying to figure out what it looks like to shut down illicit markets in a tribally controlled market.
Wow, that's really interesting. And what kind of has been the thought process? Has there been any sort of overwhelming decisions at this point, or is it still kind of early on in the decision process?
I think it really is still early on in the decision process because, tribes are not working collectively together. It's one tribe trying to figure out the beast on their own. And when we all come together, it's just the, elephant in the room. That's really why ICIA has been pivotal, because the large tribally serving organizations, our sister organizations, it's often difficult for them to have these conversations. Cannabis is still federally illegal, so they're not, other than, I think in 2016, the National Congress of American Indians passing a resolution protecting the rights of tribes and Indian self-determination in cannabis. Nothing else very progressive or aggressive in taking the reins in what tribal reform could look like with federal reform, or alternatively providing safe times and spaces for indigenous communities to gather and have the conversations themselves. And so that's kind of what we've been doing with the ICIA, is doing that within our own little think tanks, as well as reaching out to those organizations and saying, hey, put us on your agenda. We'll be those guys.
Right.
Everybody knows me, Mary Jane. I have a long history in tribal policy, with my history in serving as an elected leader in the largest, oldest American Indian education nonprofit, the National Indian Education Association. And during those times, I was living in a green closet, and I felt this huge sense of responsibility to come out of it after 2014, when tribes were left out of the Farm Bill. I was focusing all of my energy on education policy, No Child Left Behind, ESEA reform. That was like the lane that I was in. And so when I realized what was going on after the Menominee raid, which was a tribal college, I, had friends that was working on the farm when it was raided, and it became a more urgent issue for me to take what I knew about how to organize tribes and how to synthesize federal policy priorities and do that specifically for hemp and cannabis.
I appreciate you elaborating. I appreciate your works, and you actually answered like four questions that I had on my list there with that. I was like, I'm just going to sit back and shut up and just let you elaborate on that. I appreciate that. No, yeah, and it's so important because, obviously there's just so much, it just so many different levels of importance tied to this, historical, cultural, commerce, just the benefits of it. And, it just seems, like from the U.S. stateside, we always get folks frustrated at the policies going on with the federal government, but it just seems like it's just so much more amplified in this community, and obviously that's the case with you. And I was just wondering, what does it kind of take to stay determined when you're presented with so many roadblocks over and over again from the federal government? What does it take to say, what is your thought process? I guess I'm kind of yammering on here, but I guess I would really love to know, what is your thought process, and when faced with such determination or hurdles and perseverance. I'm just going to shut up. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to heavily edit that. I'm going to have to heavily edit that question down. I just could not stop talking. I'm sorry.
Is the I feel like the resilience to continue as an advocate in the cannabis industry for myself personally comes with my upbringing and my grandmother going to federal prison for growing cannabis when I was a little girl, my grandpa going to state prison for growing cannabis when I was a little girl, and them always, reinforcing that it was a medicine. And when they came home, they didn't necessarily change a whole lot. It was still a medicine in our family. There was still pockets of growth going on. It just was done a little bit more covertly. And so I think of the healing that this nation is really undergoing. I see cannabis as a big part of that. I see this nation has changed and grown a lot, even just in the last few years. The COVID pandemic was a reset for a lot of people that are no longer waiting for the permission. And that's where I sit in that. Is I came from a family that has continued to have the battle wounds for the war, and I really feel like it's my obligation to continue to do that for the other little Indigenous bloodline that will carry on beyond me. I don't want them to have the same fights that I had.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that said, so is there an ultimate goal with the ICIA that you want to see a certain kind of marketplace, or is it really just to see that sort of freedom to have people not be persecuted from it? What is the ultimate goals that you would like to see ideally?
Ideally, for tribal markets, we could own the industry. A large majority of the agricultural lands in our reservations are held in federal trust, which will bar us from being able to cultivate freely in a free market. And so until federal legalization unlocks the chains from our communities, I feel like it's just imperative to keep up that the shining the light on the inequities, and that if the industry continues to build out and grow out like this without the entire industry recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, the vibrant communities, the families that are still being impacted, that I don't know. I just really want to see the benefits versus burden scale shift at some point, and I really see that cannabis has another place in that, for tribes to be able to be less dependent on federal appropriations and to be able to have new economic revenues coming in where they have more control and say over how they use those funds for their community's needs. So it's like I guess you could say it was something that I was born into. And
Right.
then I die doing.
Uh, well, hopefully you won't have to, and hopefully there can be change before then. But yeah, it's the federal. I mean, I can only imagine what the additional frustrations and hurdles that the federal government presents for your fight. And that I think that kind of not to kind of touch on it, but kind of just right before we started recording, we had issues with the kind of the infringement of lands and things of that. Like I don't know how much you want to go into it, but we were seeing some state level enforcement showing up on land that they really are not supposed to be on. Is that correct?
We've had
Yeah.
a lot of battles in a public law 280 state, for our tribal nations, with the criminal and civil jurisdiction, and the battles, over power between the local, state, and tribal agencies. And it just, again, it always puts the people in the middle of those fights. My brother has a YouTube video that's out there of him being tased for one of the county officers running his name for no reason. And the system showed up that he had he was driving without a driver's license, which he had already had taken care of. But the officers, went to go and pull him over, followed him here onto our family's property and tased him twice. And
Jesus.
um, those kind of things over driving without a driver's license, that the law enforcement officers are willing to do that kind of bodily harm is scary. I have kids that can drive, and there's sometimes instances where there are our community members just really feel like there's no response when they need it for help. But if the call is for to come for them, then it's a rapid response. I
Right.
found myself in jurisdictional battles as well over marijuana related offenses. But I kind of brought it on myself. In 2018, I helped with several community members lead the charge for passing a resolution in our tribal government for the cultivation of up to 8 plants per household. So we weren't moving forward with anything with a retail presence, dispensary, or anything like that. We were just saying,
Home grow.
able to grow our own medicine at home. And the
Sure.
people by overwhelming majority approved that. But then we saw even our own tribal law enforcement really cracking down on marijuana penalties, even though the people voted for it.
That's insane. And so currently, Nez Perce, if I was doing my research, you have industrial hemp laws that are legalized, but nothing for THC and cannabis. Is that correct, or what's the current state of the law?
So the current state of the laws in 18, the people voted for home grow of marijuana, and it was brought back to the tribal government, and it was never enacted in our tribal law and order code. Since then, we're working as a tribal community with our government to and some of the criminal penalties and some of the areas where it inhibits employment, housing policies, doing those tweaks where we can, also working towards trigger laws specifically around Idaho. But we're a really unique situation. We also have ancestral homelands as well as trust lands in Oregon and land into trust currently pending in the state of Washington. And so our homelands span 3 different states. So legally speaking, we have alternatives outside of the state of Idaho. But when it comes to Idaho, our tribe, when we passed our plan, was also for the cultivation of CBD flower. So we also have that competitive advantage for smokable flower in our state because it's industrial fiber only for the state, but tribes can pass their own plan and include CBD.
Oh, cool. Awesome. All right. So the intricacies and the nuance. And I think that's like you said, there's so many different communities and there's so many different ways and approaches that this can be done. And, it's, I appreciate you diving in on it because, we don't, I think, get too many of the intricate breakdowns of what things are going on over in your communities and the tribes. The interesting thing I think you touched on, like you said, you being spanning 3 states, one of the biggest issues I've seen is interstate commerce. Where is that kind of going? I know, technically it's federally illegal. Is that correct? But there's still if you can go through the different territories, it's legal. Is that correct? Or how does it kind of work out and what's actually the current state of what's going on?
Well, most tribes will interpret it as, not crossing state boundaries. We have some tribes that have reservation boundaries that span into multi-states. And I think that has made things participating in, recreational cannabis industries at robust levels. But I do know that it has been an issue for one of our tribes that borders California and Nevada about what that looks like. They're very, it's not like they have to create an intergovernmental or intertribal memorandum or compact or an interstate. It's their own tribe trying to move within their ancestral homelands in 2 different states. So, that's a very unique situation. I do see that, there's, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of trade and commerce that has always gone on, that has continued to go on in the legacy markets. But tribes really, because of the scrutiny, are trying to figure out how they do it with a high bar of accountability and transparency. That's why we see tribes working on a business development plan that's for fully vertically integrated, so that they don't have to worry about importing somebody else's smokables.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's actually what we've been seeing a little bit in New York, in the area in New York with Shinnecock Nation. You know, they've been doing that, and Little Beach Harvest and Tilt was kind of the one that kind of brought in some outside investment as well. How do you feel about that? You know, with the collaboration ideas of working with more of the U.S. Established businesses with the indigenous led businesses.
I think that it's great to see collaborations when they are consulting firms that are coming in to hold the hands of tribal communities to transfer the business knowledge and the industry knowledge into that community. I think it's a very slippery slope. There are some of those groups that come in with investors, and so there's equity shares. There's some that are straight consulting, there's some that are very predatory for tribal communities, and so vetting out and doing the due diligence on the front end instead of the very expensive lesson on the back end is what we recommend that tribes do. But when it comes to some of these collaborations, it's almost a must. I mean, that large scale cultivation, indoor light depth, dry
It's a
room,
lot.
it's a lot. And that subject matter expertise isn't always in a tribal community. You have to bring somebody in to teach the community that. And that's really what we're loving to see, is that some of these partnerships and collaborations are coming with that transfer of knowledge. They're not coming in with subject matter expertises to plant themselves with high, salaries and plan to stay and retire, as a member of that tribe, adopted or anything like that.
Right, but actually just sharing the information and yeah.
Sharing the information and then moving on to another community in need, to transfer that knowledge. And that's the other thing is, not all tribes, they all want to be in different areas of cannabis, operations in another region. Why we like to see tribes within one state really working in a cooperative.
Yeah, and I mean that's the thing. It's like the one thing that's true about cannabis. I feel like across the board is collaboration really is key, and really having that community. So when you're educating other members, other aspiring applicants or nations that are looking to adopt their own laws, what do you tell them? When looking for these sort of consultants, what are sort of the things they need to look out for? What are the must haves and the red flags that they need to be looking out for?
Well, that's where we're finding ourselves in this, unique situation of working with the tribes that have successful cannabis operations or have just recently started those up, is finding out, what was your pathway to success. And in doing some of the digging around is how we're finding out that some of our tribes are in litigation with their consultants that they've worked with, or trying to figure out how to back out of an agreement, or they're still 2 years later being strung along and everything that they've contracted for, and some of the money is out the door. So we really want them to not just take the face value of a consultant coming in saying, hey, we worked for this tribe, and the only thing that tribal leader knows is that tribe is very successful. Move beyond that. Talk to the business leaders in that community. Due diligence for sure, before you enter into any agreement with these groups that are making very big promises. And a lot of the times these consultant groups are the economic feasibility and pro formas for these tribes, and they're telling them everything that they want to hear, but perhaps maybe some third party verified data on some of this economic pro formas that they're providing would also be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, more of a sign of that community and collaboration can actually be helpful for everyone. And on the flip side of that, a lot of folks who want to come in potentially and maybe be those sort of consultants or help out and actually do it from an ethical sort of perspective. I've seen it as a journalist. Some folks in the indigenous communities really are hesitant to work with the outsiders, and rightfully so. How can someone who wants to come in and help do it in a way that is actually establishes trust and shows that they're not trying to take advantage of the community? And obviously their actions are going to do it, but how else? Is there any other ways that you need to do it to show that there's the respect and the wanting to actually come from a genuine place from it?
Well, I'm not just saying it because it's my job as the hype woman for the ICIA, but joining the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association is a great start. You have to be prepared to review and abide by our code of ethics. And that's just, the basic human responsibility of doing good things to each other. It's, you don't have to sign over your firstborn child or anything like that. It's really imperative though that we build a community, and through the community that we've built already have flushed out some of the bad actors. And we've also had some of the contractors and consulting groups that are out there doing work in mainstream have been very successful and really have no point of entry into tribes. Like, they may have tribes in their region, but they don't, like, do I pick up the phone and call the chairman, or,
Right.
how do I actually engage in a conversation with this tribe? And that's where our organization can help. What we're finding now is it's the tribes that are interested in cannabis that are kind of coming to us and working back outwards. And so we are creating that network of trusted, I don't want to say necessarily that we're doing the vetting, but they have been willing to sign the code of ethics. They're wanting to come on board to do good things for tribes, and they're not a part of the network that we wouldn't want involved.
Makes sense. And if you can you dive in a little bit of the code of ethics? What do you expect of the companies to comply and do things right?
Well, there's the business ethics side of things, the responsibility of leaving the value in the community is really important to us. Being able to not have that economic footprint leave our community, which goes with abiding by tribal law and rule. Many of our reservation communities go through tribal preference, Indian preference in hiring. We're not talking about just at the dispensary. We're talking about on the front end. If there's opportunities, for these tribal community members to also work within that business framework or infrastructure, the general standard industry ethos around, or what we would like to see around environmental protections. I think that we need to be doing better within the industry of creating a more regenerative cannabis industry. And for us, that is a big conversation when it comes to some of the packaging systems and some of the safety requirements that are being imposed by rules and regulations that may not necessarily have to have that same nuance in tribal laws. But it's not a very smart industry starting out when it comes to environmental protections. And so that's a big part of our code of conduct, is building out economic systems in cannabis that are more respective of the environment.
And and if anybody wants to agree to those terms and start working with you and sign up, and how do they get involved? How do they get in touch with you?
Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association on LinkedIn, as well as our website, indigenouscannabis.org. It's really you can go there and sign up for our free newsletter. We're getting information out there about what tribes are doing. I believe in the last 2 months, 3 new tribal dispensaries come online across the nation. We're stocking a few others that are getting ready to do their development. Of course, there was the big news down there at the Eastern Band of Cherokee about Principal Chief Sneed vetoing a secondary budget proposal for, millions of dollars for their cannabis operations, and they haven't even opened the doors yet. So, we work with communities on a lot of different issues, and really need allies as a part of our network. I mean, we are a very marginalized community, but we realize that a lot of the build out that's happened so far has been because of the trusted allies that really want to see equity in the cannabis industry actually include Indigenous communities.
Absolutely. So get in touch if you want to be an ally and actually help out. And is there anything else that you can do to help support the cause and get the word out and, educate more folks on not just Indigenous cannabis, but just Indigenous issues altogether?
Yes. If you are one of those people that is charged with building the stages at cannabis conferences, plug in some of our experts. Reach out to us at the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. We are well networked with the business, policy professionals, regulators back across Indian country. So it's not just us, it's our member network that we're really trying to get on the podium to be able to tell their own stories. I am come from a long line of storytellers, and I feel like that is really, really important during this time is the preservation of this very historic time. That's why I'm a huge fan of yours, Andrew, because you know, hundreds of years from now, they're going to be looking back on this time that happened to end this war on this amazing, beautiful sister plant. And I know that your mark has definitely been made because you want to talk about the good and the bad and the ugly, because we have to learn from our mistakes.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to do my little part in something big, and hopefully I'm making an impact. So hearing that from you, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Mary Jane. I definitely want to, help get the word out on a lot of these issues. These are a lot of the times, no knock to the media, but the stories just aren't being told for one reason or another. And, we got videos, we got Zoom. Let's record some calls and get the word out and talk to more people and, spread the word and hopefully educate and, start building some more allyship. So yeah, I appreciate you taking the time and doing this. And I have a million more questions, so I think I just need to invite you back for another time before we talk for 4 hours on this one. So
Thank you for that. We are also working on an educational documentary for the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association. So all of the generous support and donations and membership, it's all going back to great advocacy, technical assistance, and education campaigns. And for us, that's getting back across Indian country for this documentary.
Oh, awesome. Is there, did you say there's like a GoFundMe or anything to get that supportive, or?
There's not a GoFundMe, but, through our website, reach out to us. We have a deck ready for investors and supporters to review, but it's not too big of a budget, so we're going to get there. But cool. We have a goal of being able to release in 2024. So we've started filming even though we didn't have a budget.
Gotta love it. That's the film spirit right there. And we're going to be dropping in little updates on the bottom here, so we'll be putting links and stuff in there, so I can drop that in there for you if you want. Mary Jane, This has been amazing. One last thing I always love to do before the interview is over, turn it over to you. Obviously, we're talking about a ton of subjects here, but anything else you wanted to share before we wrap things up today?
I just really wanted to share that it's been an honor to be working on behalf of Indigenous communities. I can very freely share the story of the Nez Perce people in my own personal walk, but to be able to provide a safe place for other community members to share their stories and feature their work through THC Magazine has been such an honor. That's how I've been able to meet wonderful people like Shanae Bullock out there at Little Beach Harvest for the Shinnecock community. She's like a sister to me now, and I'm really excited for the endeavor that they have coming up and hope to make it to their grand opening and maybe even meet you in person if you're going to be there.
Yeah, I would love to. I highly recommend people go check out Shinnecock Cannabis when you get a chance, Little Beach when they open up, and the other shops that are there, and just check out Indigenous Cannabis whenever you get a chance to. There's some really great brands, really great people operating them. So yeah, sign me up, Mary Jane. Hopefully I will be seeing you soon. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. I definitely want to have you back and get more Indigenous voices out there on this show and other platforms. So let's make it happen. Mary Jane Oatman, Executive Director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association and the founder of THC Magazine. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you doing this. Let's link up soon, and hopefully I see you in person soon.
Thank you. I appreciate it.